Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us for this important conversation about lawn fertilizers sold and used on Long Island and in Westchester County. Long Island's underground aquifers and surface waters, which provide drinking water for millions, sources of food and recreational activities, and habitat and breeding grounds for the wildlife with whom we share this island, are being impacted by a common source: synthetic fertilizers high in water-soluble nitrogen and containing known and emerging contaminants, including PFAS chemicals and micro and nanoplastics. These harmful components of fertilizers don't stay on our lawns. They move through the soil into our groundwater, which eventually flows from our taps and runs off into our bays, rivers, lakes, and ponds, and, as is the case in Westchester, our reservoirs. Today's webinar will explore the science behind this triple threat, the risks to our health and our environment, and the many practical solutions available. We're going to begin today with some new science on microplastics. Many popular slow-release lawn fertilizers contain polymer-coated or plastic-encapsulated particles, which are designed to release nutrients more slowly. But as the plastic breaks down from the elements, especially UV radiation from the sun, micro and nanoplastic particles can migrate through the soil and become airborne, carrying with them other toxins they pick up along the way. Now it is my pleasure to introduce our subject area expert, Dr. Sanjay Mohanty. Dr. Mohanty is Associate Professor in the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering at UCLA's Institute of the Environment and Sustainability. Dr. Mohanty, it's all yours.
Thank you, Patty and Doug, for the invitations. I'm an associate professor at UCLA, and I work on a variety of pollutants, starting from microplastic, PFAS, and other heavy metals. I work mostly on how these contaminants move in stormwater, how they move through the soil once you apply these kind of fertilizers on the soil. So today I'm going to focus mostly on the microplastic. What is microplastics? Microplastics are a fragment of plastic particles that comes out from any plastic materials. By definition, these are less than the size of a small bead, 5 millimeters. It can vary with a density as small as 0.9 to 1.4. What that means is it can be lighter than water. It can be lighter than also soil particles, and that's key. Because of their lighter particles, they are easy to move in water and wind. So again, here I want to focus on biosolid. Wastewater contains many plastic particles because of things that it collects. And here in our study, we survey more than hundreds of wastewater treatment plants. We measure the concentration of microplastic that are coming in and leaving the systems and how much remain in the biosolids. And based on that, we found that there are so many microplastic and biosolid. And what is more surprising is that when people take this biosolid and measure those microplastic, that's what they find is only 4% of microplastic that is present in biosolid. About 96%, which is still there, but it can be detected. The reason it cannot be detected, we believe, is because they are very small. Microplastic detection method has been evolving over time. Currently, it's not very good at detecting very, very small nanoplastics. So we believe that wastewater treatment plants makes those microplastics more fragmented, and also it's coated with other chemicals and materials, which makes it very difficult to detect them. And there are many other studies that shows that if you take these biosolid-based lawn fertilizers and apply them on your lawn, over time the microplastic concentration increase in those lawn. So that's why we ask these questions. What happened to those microplastics once you apply these fertilizers on your lawn? We estimate how much microplastics you expect to find in water. Here, the list of many different water resources, stormwater, urban canals, wetland, lake, rivers, estuaries. What is surprising for us that we found microplastic concentrations is very high in glacier and snow. And then the second highest is stormwater. So again, stormwater is expected because all the plastic trash we dump outside will ended up in stormwater. So it was not surprising. But what was surprising is glacier. The only way plastic can get to glacier is by wind. So we did a little bit more study to understand why plastic moves so easily on wind. Here, this study just to show that what happens with the plastics once it's on your lawn. So here is the depth of, this is the y-axis is the depth. It's basically how deep you can go and how much plastic you will find. What we see in this graph, the way to interpret is the top surface, top 2 inches of soil layer contains most of the microplastics. So even though you are applying these fertilizers, plastics are not moving deeper. They are still accumulating in the surface at that top soil where the most of the root sections are. So that has implication on the plant health, that has implication on human health. I'll get to that again next. So here we take the same soil that was already contaminated with plastic and we apply stormwater to understand how much those plastics can be resuspended. So typically any infiltrating stormwater will remove most of the microplastics in those top soil layer. And so why it is important? Because the density of any sediments is much higher than the plastics. That's why it's very easy to lift up by buoyancies. So we believe that most of the plastic that is on the lawn will not stay there. It will move around by stormwater. And this is much more important because you can capture stormwater, but you cannot do anything about wind. Wind can blow anywhere. There is no way to prevent that. So these studies, we use a wind tunnel and blow the winds on an applied field in agriculture, and we see how much plastics are being lifted up. What we found that the plastics are being very non-sticky because they are hydrophobic. They do not stick with water. So even you spray water, it will not prevent plastic to be entrained by air. So normal practice is whenever you don't want any dust, you apply this moisture or water. But the same practice is not preventing plastic to being picked up by even a small breeze. So that's why it was highlighted in LA Times and other places. So story doesn't end there. It's not just the plastics. Once they're on the lawn or in the soil, they also interact with other type of pollutants that is already present in soil. Here in this graph, just to show you how long pollutants survive in nature, I want to highlight the top three. Metals, they don't degrade, so they are forever. PFAS is another forever chemicals. The reason they are forever chemical is going to be last there for many years. And plastic also do not degrade. So what that means is all these pollutants coexist together in lawn or the soil, contaminated soil, and that allow plastic to absorb some of these pollutants. That makes them much more toxic. So just to illustrate, I want to show you this data. This is just a mini lab study just to show different type of plastic, PET, polypropylene, polystyrene, PVC, and how much PFAS they can absorb. And again, just to show that the variable amount of PFAS can bind into these plastics. So what that means, what we learned so far. We learned that biosolid-based fertilizers contain lots of plastics or microplastic, nanoplastics. Many of them are not detected. So when you apply this biosolid-based fertilizer, you are enriching the soil with a lot of plastics. Eventually, you will have so much plastic that it will impact the soil health itself. And second, they are not going to stay there. Wind and stormwater can blow them or carry them and spread them across properties. Particularly wind can move them miles and miles, and there is no way you can stop that. And the last one, the microplastic itself may not be as toxic, but because they are staying coexisting with other pollutants, by observing them, they increase the risk of human health. So with that, I'll end this presentations, and I'm happy to answer any question in futures. If you have any questions, you can also email me. Thank you.
Thank you, Sanjay, for that great overview. If there are questions, we will take them at the end of the presentations. And just to be clear for our audience, some kinds of fertilizers sold and used on Long Island and in Westchester contain plastic-covered particles and some do not. So here's a slide that shows the plastic-covered fertilizer on the left and another brand of fertilizer that doesn't contain plastic on the right. These are both fertilizers that are being sold at garden centers and green industry suppliers across Long Island and in Westchester County. Next, we turn to PFAS chemicals in fertilizers. These are often called forever chemicals because their chemical bonds are incredibly strong, and as a result, they do not readily break down in the environment. PFAS chemicals have been detected not only in biosolids used as fertilizer, but also in some plastic-coated slow-release fertilizers. These chemicals are linked to serious human health concerns and are increasingly showing up in water supplies across the country, including worrisome levels here on Long Island. To tell us more about what we are learning regarding PFAS chemicals and specifically PFAS in fertilizers and their impact on human health, I'm very pleased to introduce Dr. Kyla Bennett. Dr. Bennett worked for the EPA for 10 years as an analyst and now serves as Director of Science Policy at Public Employees for Environmental Responsibility, or PEER. She has a PhD in ecology from the University of Connecticut and a law degree from Lewis and Clark Law School in Portland, Oregon. Kyla?
Thank you so much, Patty. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit today about PFAS in fertilizer, both in the biosolids and also the bagged fertilizer. So first, let's start with what are PFAS. PFAS is an acronym for per and polyfluoroalkyl substances. It's a very large family of chemicals, more than 10,000. Some people say there are millions of them. The one thing that all of these chemicals have in common is this carbon-fluorine bond. And that bond between carbon atoms and fluorine atoms is one of the strongest bonds known in organic chemistry. All PFAS chemicals are synthetic. They are man-made. I usually say human-made, but in this case, they were definitely made by men. All of them are persistent. Many of them bioaccumulate in your body, and all that we have studied are toxic. Unfortunately, we only have good toxicity studies on about 40 of these PFAS. And remember, I said that there are more than 10,000. Now, one of the things that you'll hear as you see manufacturer claims on things like fertilizers is that there are good PFAS and bad PFAS. I don't believe that's true, but one of the things that they talk about are long chain PFAS versus short chain. And what they mean about that is the number of carbons in the backbone of the chemical structure. So these two PFAS that I have here on the screen, PFOA and PFOS, are the two legacy PFAS, the ones that have been around the longest. EPA recently, in April of 2024, they put out drinking water regulations that said there is actually zero safe level, no safe level of either PFOA or PFOS, but their drinking water regulations said 4 parts per trillion. That is a minuscule amount. And the reason it is so low is because these chemicals can be so toxic. Now, states are trying to also regulate PFAS and try to fill the regulatory void that EPA has left in its wake, because EPA under this administration is not doing a lot on PFAS. So where are PFAS found? They're everywhere. They're in firefighting foams. They're in the turnout gear of firefighters, which is why they have such a high cancer rate, microwave popcorn bags, rain gear, water-resistant clothing. They're in paints and glues. They're in personal care products like shampoos and conditioners. They can be in sunscreens, in Sharpies, in your nonstick cookware, in furniture and carpets, in pesticides, and in a lot of plastic bottles, and also things like artificial turf. So the reason that PFAS is in our biosolids and in our fertilizer is because when you take a bath or a shower, or you wash out your frying pan that you just cooked eggs in, all of that PFAS is going to go down the drain. And if you are living on a sewer system, all of that water goes to the sewer system where it's treated. It goes to a wastewater treatment plant. But unfortunately, wastewater treatment plants were not designed to remove PFAS. And indeed, what scientists have found is that the amount of PFAS in the influent, the stuff coming into the wastewater treatment plant, is less than the stuff coming out in the effluent. So the treatment process actually creates more PFAS. How? They do it because PFAS chemistry is complex, and some of these things will degrade and then form new PFAS together. So when it goes through the treatment process, we actually create more PFAS. So how do PFAS get into fertilizer? PFAS used in manufacturing, they go into the air. There are 3 routes of exposure for PFAS. It can be ingested, it can be inhaled, or it can be dermally absorbed. So it can get into the air. It comes out of the smokestacks if you try to burn it. If you landfill it, it gets into the landfill leachate. In our homes, we're flushing it down the toilet and down our kitchen sink and down our showers. All of that goes to the wastewater treatment plant. It discharges to a river where the PFAS goes there. And then sewage sludge or biosolids. What happens is these wastewater treatment plants will remove the water from all of that human waste, and they treat that and dump it into a river. And then for the solids, they'll dry it and sell it as fertilizer. Sometimes it's sold by the truckload to farms, but other biosolids are actually packaged into the fertilizer that you use for your lawn. So when you're spreading fertilizer on your lawn, if that fertilizer has PFAS, you are contaminating your own yard, your own garden, your own water. What are some other sources of PFAS in packaged fertilizer other than the biosolids? Wood shavings, paper products, for example, some of these composted things that go into fertilizers are food waste, food leftovers, and the paper that holds them. And a lot of those have PFAS contamination. And of course, contaminated water. This is a headline from a Boston Globe article from 2022, where a composting facility that just took in compost contaminated an entire town in Westminster, Massachusetts. Everybody's that lived nearby this composting facility, their wells were contaminated by PFAS. So how much PFAS is in packaged fertilizer? This is from a great report done by the Ecology Center in Ann Arbor, Michigan, and also Sierra Club. And the units here are parts per billion. Now, remember when I told you at the very beginning of this talk that PFAS are regulated in parts per trillion, much smaller than parts per billion. And what they're finding here is it looks like, 40 parts per billion up to, 225 parts per billion. How do you translate that into parts per trillion? You move the decimal place over 3 places. So we're talking about 40,000 parts per trillion to 225,000 parts per trillion of these PFAS. And some of these PFAS are the two that I told you there is no safe level of, PFOA and PFOS. So these are massive quantities of PFAS that can be found in packaged fertilizers. Why is that dangerous? PFAS can impact so many parts of the human body. They are known to cause kidney cancer and testicular cancer. Firefighters have both of those. They've been linked to liver damage, increased cholesterol, obesity, thyroid disease. For women, preeclampsia, increased miscarriage. For children, developmental delays. And one of the most important things in my mind is that PFAS, if you have high PFAS in your bloodstream, it can make vaccines not work on you. So if you're getting a vaccine for the flu or for COVID, if you have high levels of PFAS in your body, those vaccines will not work well. So PFAS can be very, very dangerous, and we do not want to ingest them. So PFAS gets into our groundwater easily from agricultural areas or from homeowners that are using these bagged fertilizers. You spread those fertilizers, they go into the soil, they get into the groundwater. And when you're talking about a sole source aquifer like Long Island or Nantucket or here where I live in Massachusetts, once you contaminate that sole source aquifer, there's really no going back. There's not much you can do. You cannot pump out the entire aquifer and filter the water and put it back in. And also, the PFAS that are in the soil will slowly leach into the groundwater and our drinking water for years, decades, hundreds of years to come. Remember, these are extremely persistent chemicals that don't break down. So once you put that PFAS on the soil, it gets into your groundwater. It's very, very difficult. One of the only things we can do is wait. The other thing I wanted to mention is biomagnification. So when you put fertilizer on your, let's say you're growing hay for cows, the PFAS in that fertilizer will be in the soil and in the groundwater. It will get into the grasses that are eaten by a cow. And then when you eat beef or drink milk from a cow, the amount of PFAS is crazy high, much higher than the amounts that you saw in the fertilizer. That's called biomagnification. And we tested some cow meat in Texas that the farm across the street had spread biosolids. And we found 610,000 parts per trillion of PFOS. Again, no safe level. And in the calf liver, there was 610,000 parts per trillion of PFOS, just PFOS. So this biomagnification is something of concern. So I know this sounded depressing. What are the solutions? The solutions federally are for EPA to define PFAS broadly. Right now, they have a fairly narrow definition. They also need to regulate them as a class of chemicals instead of this one by one whack-a-mole approach where they're regulating, one chemical here and then another chemical. You need to regulate the entire family. Then we need to ban all non-essential uses and finally find alternatives for whatever essential uses. And when I'm talking about essential uses, I'm not talking about waterproof mascara. I'm talking about medicines like Paxlovid or Prozac are PFAS. But in the short term, what can you do? You can minimize your risk. Get a water filter. Try not to buy fertilizers that have PFAS. Try not to buy consumer products that have PFAS. And I'm happy to answer any questions at the end of this. Thank you for allowing me to speak.
Thank you so much, Kyla, for sharing your deep knowledge of this subject. It was really informative. The amounts that you're talking about are just astounding, but that's where we are when we're talking about these particular chemicals. And again, just to be clear, not every fertilizer contains PFAS, but you certainly won't be able to tell from the label. Generally speaking, any fertilizer that contains biosolids is going to contain PFAS. And we know that many products that contain plastic coatings often contain PFAS because it aids in the manufacture of almost all plastic products. So those are not intentionally added. And finally, when a manufacturer says that their product is PFAS-free, we want to be sure that means the product doesn't contain any PFAS. But some manufacturers are using an old California law that set a level of 100 parts per million as the threshold below which they can claim their products are PFAS-free. But that standard was adopted more than 5 years ago based on science from more than a decade ago. And since then, we've learned much more about how toxic these chemicals are in minute concentrations. Dr. Linda Birnbaum, the former director of the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences and the National Toxicology Program, says that we should be testing for PFAS at parts per quadrillion, and that's 1 billion times more stringent than the old California standard. So when a fertilizer company says its product is PFAS-free, is that based on the old, outdated California standard, or does that mean there is no PFAS in the product? Those are two very different things. In New York, fertilizer manufacturers are currently not required to disclose whether their products contain PFAS. Now, finally, we have the third threat to our environment and our health, which is excess nitrogen. This problem has been plaguing the lawn care industry for years, and many people have worked hard to figure out a way to address it, especially on Long Island and in other regions which are solely or partially dependent on groundwater. To set the stage for our next speaker, we know that many of the most popular lawn fertilizers sold and used in our suburban New York communities contain very high levels of water-soluble nitrogen. And while nitrogen is a nutrient essential for plant growth, a significant portion of what is applied is never taken up into the grass plants. Instead, it leaches through sandy soils below the root level, particularly prevalent on Long Island, or is washed away by stormwater into our surface waters. The result is contamination of groundwater and harmful algal blooms, fish kills, and long-term aquatic and environmental damage. Dr. Omanjana Goswami is an interdisciplinary scientist with the Food and Environment Program at the Union of Concerned Scientists. She is an expert in environmental justice, marine conservation, and contaminants like nitrogen. And it is now my pleasure to welcome Dr. Goswami.
Thank you, Patty, for the introduction. At UCS, we mostly focus on a federal approach to regulating not just nitrogen, but also other contaminants, especially as it pertains to food and agriculture. And nitrogen is perhaps the biggest nutrient that is applied in agricultural systems. In a recent analysis that me and my coworker, Dr. Precious, did on analyzing what exactly is the quantity of nitrogen that is applied, we found that as of 2022, 78% of all U.S. agricultural land, which roughly equals to about 236 million acres, received synthetic fertilizers of some kind. A large majority of of those fertilizers, about 58% of what was applied is direct nitrogen. The remaining 20% each is either phosphorus or potassium. Together, these form the NPK, the Holy Trinity, as I like to call it, group of fertilizers, which usually both farmers and recreational users, like as it happens in our backyards and our lawns, apply every year, either to sustain grass or agriculturally to sustain crops. We found that in 2023, about 11.62 million metric tons was actually used in the US, and that included all categories. About 3 million metric tons of fertilizer was applied in lawns alone. Now, plants need nitrogen to sustain for growth, for photosynthesis, and for protein synthesis, as well as to maintain their functions. But not all of the nitrogen that we apply is actually used up. There is a substantial body of peer-reviewed scientific literature that shows that as much as 50% of all the fertilizer that we're applying actually isn't even used up by the plant. It remains behind in the soil and then creates environmental havoc. Essentially runs off into water, degrades into gases, or just stays there and creates further problem down the line. So how does nitrogen actually move in the environment? And this excess nitrogen that's kind of sitting around in our lawns, that's sitting around in agricultural fields, is the biggest problem. So essentially, there are three main pathways through which nitrogen enters the environment. The first is it is washed out by rainfall, it is washed out by water. What nitrogen runoff does is it creates algal blooms. It kind of gives bacteria food to multiply really quickly and create these fast tracts of algal blooms, which use up all the dissolved oxygen in water, creating hypoxia or low oxygen zones where really fish and aquatic plants don't get enough oxygen to survive, and leads to massive fish kills and plant deaths in that body of water. It also creates this green mat on the water of algae and impairs recreational water quality. Often less talked about is the air pollution impact of nitrogen runoff. How much is nitrogen responsible when it comes to contribution to climate change? And as per a recent report by UCS, we found that as much as 120 million metric tons of greenhouse gases or heat trapping gases was emitted all over the US. And this includes all use category, including lawns. So what happens is when nitrogen sits in the soil, it is acted upon by microbial matter, and it breaks down into gases such as nitrous oxide, ammonia, and carbon dioxide, which is emitted into the atmosphere. And this is in addition to all of the water pollution impacts. Now, nitrous oxide is a pretty powerful greenhouse gas. It can absorb as much as 273 times more heat than the same quantity of carbon dioxide. And according to EPA, about 6% of all greenhouse gas in the US is nitrous oxide. And 75% of that nitrous oxide directly comes from agricultural soils that have received fertilizers of some kind. The graph that I have on the right of the slide is what we found in our analysis. And these numbers, again, are for the entirety of US. But I just want to point that yellow bar, that's the direct nitrous oxide contribution of fertilizer. And that's about 40% of all of the emissions. I've talked about the environmental component of nitrogen pollution impact, but there is also a bigger and perhaps more serious public health implications of nitrogen exposure. It has the potential to leach into groundwater sources, which it does. It runs off into reservoirs and sources from which we get our drinking water. And the form of nitrogen that human beings in particular are exposed to are nitrates. And nitrates in particular are the most reactive form of nitrogen. That's what makes it move very quickly through the environment. That's the form that plants also need to absorb. But that's also the form that impacts human beings the most. And when children in particular are exposed to high levels of nitrate in drinking water, they have oxygen deficiency in their system, which causes what is popularly known as blue baby syndrome or methemoglobinemia. And that is pretty widely reported in agriculture states, which see a lot of nitrogen. But more seriously and more recently, there has been a big body of scientific literature that has looked at exposure to nitrates and its linkages to various kinds of cancer. And I think last year, a couple of media outlets did a story where as much as 300 cases of cancer in Iowa was directly linked with exposure to nitrates in drinking water. And these included various types of cancer, including colon cancer, bladder cancer, and ovarian cancer. So we are really seeing not just short-term chronic exposure or acute exposure, but chronic exposure leading to long-term, extremely serious health implications when it comes to nitrogen exposure in particular. The market is inundated with various kinds of fertilizer. And I try to kind of take a picture of just the sheer amount of forms that nitrogen can exist in. But it's very, very important to remember nitrogen does not behave differently just based off of where it's coming from. Just because agricultural use is more and more widely reported doesn't mean the same nitrogen is going to behave any differently if you're applying it to your lawns. It'll cause all the same environmental and human health damage, no matter its origin. And I want to take a moment to talk about the impact and the influence that agribusiness corporations, and in particular fertilizer manufacturers, have on public perception as well as influencing policy. We've seen that fertilizer labels in general are very confusing. It has a lot of scientific information, and there are directions on how to dissolve it, in what concentration, how much to apply that in land. It needs a little bit of math in the back, which often home users don't really know how to do, or they shouldn't be expected to know how to do that math to be able to apply to grow food or to maintain grass in their lawns, right? And how we've gotten here so far is by aggressive lobbying that the fertilizer industry in particular has used when we're talking of fertilizer, but also overall the massive chokehold that agribusiness corporations have on, in particular, federal policy. In about 5 years, agribusiness corporations spent about $500 million in lobbying Congress. And we found that some of the major spenders were, to no one's surprise, corporations which have a direct stake in fertilizers and chemicals. So really, what we're fighting here is fighting big ag and fighting people with very, very deep pockets. So it just shows that the fight needs to get that stronger to fight this fight. And I'll just pause here and I'll pass it back to Patty to wrap us up.
So thank you so much, Dr. Goswami, for that great presentation. Just to think about the the things that you presented here is just overwhelming. So anyway, we've heard now about the threat posed by micro and nanoplastics in lawn fertilizer, the risks of introducing PFAS into our environment from any source, including lawn fertilizer, and the emerging science on the potential harm that excess nitrogen in lawn fertilizers can inflict not only on the environment, but on our own health as well. So clearly, we need to do something about the fact that in a few weeks, homeowners, landscapers, retailers, and manufacturers will all be engaged in business as usual, participating in the welcome advent of spring. They'll be spreading fertilizers and pre-emergent weed killers on lawns, fields, and parks. And the very first applications of the growing season will unfortunately just add to our burden of toxins. The good news, and it is very good news, is that we are not powerless to do something about this. Safer alternatives are already on the market. Lawn fertilizers that don't contain plastic coatings, PFAS, or excessive levels of soluble nitrogen, which we define at 12%. And by the way, nitrogen is the first number on the bag. They are widely available to both homeowners and professional landscapers. So I want to thank everyone for participating. Thank you especially to our experts for their invaluable information, and thank you to our supporting organizations, and thank everyone for attending today's presentation.